So, good afternoon. As it is just past the hour, I think I would like to start this session. As this is going to be a very interactive session, why don't we all move up a little bit closer and so that we can see each other in the eye a little bit more. So I invite you to come and sit here and we'll see what happens from there. Welcome to the workshop on internet consolidation, on opportunities and challenges. Let me highlight very shortly what we intend to do in this session. We'll first have an introduction on the topic. You can see a few slides coming by, and that introduction will be presented by Jari Arko and by Carl Gahnberg. They will introduce themselves, I'm sure, just before they start the session. From there, we're going to walk through 4 different topics, which will be very briefly introduced by the person in the org team who drove that part of the discussion. It will be on technical implications, on competition, on the social implications, and of future research into internet consolidation. All through this session, we'll be on the lookout for examples, good or bad, of this internet consolidation. And because this is going to be an interactive session, we're going to ask you to respond, to bring your examples, ask your questions to the experts, and share your experiences and knowledge with us. Because the idea is that we do not just have a little result on the website of EuroDIG when we conclude this session, but to try to come up with actual action points and actual recommendations for specific stakeholder communities so that we can translate this into future studies, into future actions, or future standards, perhaps even, who knows. With that is the future. At the end of the session, our rapporteur, Clément, will lead us through everything he heard here and try to summarize some key messages for us. And to introduce myself finally, my name is Wouter Natris. I run my own consultancy and I have the pleasure of being your moderator for this afternoon. And with that, I give the floor to Carl, who will lead us through the first part of the presentation. Carl.
Thank you very much. So my name is Carl Gahnberg. I work as a policy advisor with the Internet Society. And together with Jari, I'm going to try to kick off this discussion this afternoon with a relatively quick presentation about this topic of consolidation, trying to create a somewhat shared understanding about what we mean by it, some of the trends that we've been seeing in regards to this phenomenon, and some of the considerations and questions that we at ISOC has raised, and also hear a little bit from Jari the considerations and questions that he has observed. And then the idea is to sort of invite the room, and hopefully we're going to have a shared conversation around this topic. But it's useful to kind of start off this session with bluntly putting on the screen what we mean by internet consolidation and trying to define it as best as we can to hopefully create a shared understanding of what we're talking about. So what you see here is actually taken from one of Jari's texts and an internet draft that they're working on, where the phenomenon of internet consolidation can be described as that process of increasing control over internet infrastructure and services by a small set of organizations. That is sort of the common denominator of what we will be discussing here today. But it's important to consider that that phenomenon can be approached from multiple perspectives. So some of you might have a legal background and might be sort of instinctively thinking about competition policy or consumer protection and might be approaching this phenomenon from that angle. Some of you might be working in cybersecurity and your instinct goes to thinking about, let's say, software monocultures and the impact on security and reliability or resilience. While others, if you perhaps run a startup, your approach to consolidation might be coming from concerns around interoperability or your ability to innovate or sort of pursue economic opportunities online. And then the broader public, the broader society might be approaching this topic from an angle of a distribution of power or a shift of distribution of power where some private companies are seemingly gaining an increased power vis-a-vis public institutions, for example. So you can approach this topic from multiple angles, and that is exactly what we're intending to do here today. But the common denominator for all of that is this phenomenon of internet consolidation, of a small set of organizations having increasing control over internet infrastructure and services. So given the fact that you can approach this topic and you might sort of associate it and have different connotations related to consolidation, and also approach it with your own considerations, it's kind of useful to think about consolidation as fundamentally about a pattern where many of the same suddenly becomes fewer of the same. That is sort of the essence of the pattern that we're thinking about. And it's useful to think about it as a pattern also to compare it to other concepts that can also be described as patterns, like concentration, for example, where you don't have a reduction in the number of dots here, but rather they're sort of focused on a few locations. So that's one way of thinking about the concepts of consolidation versus concentration. And Jari is going to talk a little bit about centralization as well. So what are the trends of consolidation? Well, at the Internet Society, we started looking at this phenomenon last year, and was doing some work in 2018 that amounted into a report that we published earlier this year, which we call the Global Internet Report 2019. And the overarching question that was sort of guiding our research was the one that you see on the screen here. Are there trends of consolidation in the internet economy? And if so, how will consolidation impact the internet's technical evolution and use? So that was the angle that we took on this trend of consolidation. So what we did was that we tried to get a kind of a bird's eye view of these trends, trying to look at all the various markets, or as many markets as possible, that all together make up this internet economy. And for awareness, we define the internet economy as those economic activities that either support the internet, for example, an ISP would be supporting the internet, or a economic activity that is fundamentally dependent on the internet, such as a streaming service, for example. And what we did was that we took this bird's eye view, looked at the trends that we could see, and then we tried to explain what we think are important considerations in regards to those trends, and also try to think a little bit about what does this mean for the Internet Society in terms of future work. Is there some actions we might want to take, recommendations? But what the main outcome of that report was that we needed to learn more, and that there's a need for future and further research on this topic. So that's what we're doing this year. And that's part of the reason why we're having these type of consultations, to learn more from other stakeholders and engage in discussion. But to give you the sum of the trends that we saw, so what we did was that we took the internet economy and then we broke it down into these three domains to try to make it a little bit more manageable for us when we were looking at it, but also a bit more digestible for the reader. So we separated here to what you see here on the left, internet applications, that you can think about those businesses that are dependent on using the internet to deliver their service. So it would be, for example, search business, it would be online advertisement, social networking, or online retail, for example. And I think, to no great surprise, we saw those trends of consolidation in this space, where, of course, you have a few dominant players in some of those key areas. But what we raise in this section also is that a lot of their success, or dominance, depending on how you look at it, is fundamentally connected to this logic of platforms and the fact that they're spurring network effects, which in turn allows them to branch out into other markets. So, for example, if you think about Facebook, is more than just a social network. They also offer, for example, a consumer-to-consumer marketplace, which can be seen as competing with eBay, for example. Access provision is actually the section that we struggle the most with in trying to project or describe a global trend, given that those markets are highly local. But in this section, we tried to point to what we think are sort of important factors driving the expansion of large companies in access provision. So, of course, market maturity plays a big role, but also regulatory issues that might be favoring large companies. Other issues like spectrum auctions that might be favoring an incumbent. But overall, that section was pretty hard for us to describe, given that you might have very stark regional or even national or local differences. The service infrastructure here, the third domain, essentially encompass those businesses that help the internet coming into being and for people to use the internet and deploy services. So it includes things like cloud computing, DNS services, transit, content delivery networks. And again, what we saw when we looked at those markets were also these trends of consolidation where you have a small set of organizations essentially having quite significant market shares in all of those markets. But what we were interested in was to try to take this as the sort of jumping off point and try to think a little bit both towards the future and some important considerations into this trend, essentially trying to extrapolate a little bit. So in this report, we describe what we think is 5 key considerations. So one of them, for example, up to the top left here, total service environments, describes a trend where you as a user would essentially be facing a one-stop shop when you're online, where you can spend a very productive day just staying within one service provider's ecosystem. But similarly also, if you're a small or medium business, you can go to, for example, a public cloud provider that will give you access and capabilities that you can deploy on a global scale that wasn't even available for some of the largest companies in the world just 5-10 years ago. So it offers incredible opportunities, but it also raised the question if this trend towards these total service environments is inevitable or if we can have a more diverse and dynamic internet economy going forward. The second one here, interoperability is a function of scale. We're trying to see what the influence of large companies have on both the adoption of important standards, but also the development of new ones. And the key question here is really, would we be facing a future where sort of collaboration take a backseat and we live in a reality where we have sort of benevolent rule makers that we all need to just relate to, and there's this notion of collaboration is gone, basically. Changing internet topology is fundamentally about new patterns of interconnection, both where you see a trend of more sort of densely interconnection of access networks through IXPs, but also a proliferation of content delivery networks, and also where you have content providers, for example, deploying their own global infrastructure, for example, submarine cables to exchange data between their global data centers. And the question here is really fundamentally, would the general purpose internet take a backseat to these specialized networks? Is the internet going to be a thing of the past as we sort of moving along a trend like this? Deep dependencies, as the question indicates, it's kind of using the analogy of too big to fail, in the sense that are there services out there that would effectively, if they were to have a service failure, create sort of cascading effects up the stack for other technologies or for other businesses built on top of that. And it raises the question from what we at the Internet Society think is a sort of important feature of the Internet, the notion that it doesn't have any permanent favorites. Could this effectively create permanent favorites where you have a dependency on a few large actors? And then the final one here, response to consolidation. We look at both how other stakeholder groups might be approaching this topic, but also importantly how governments might try to address these concerns through regulation or competition policy. And sort of the essence of that problem is, if you think about the internet, it's sort of premised on voluntary rules. For example, open standards is one of the critical features of it, but what happens then if you have mandatory rules being imposed on that network? Would they come in conflict with those voluntary rules? Or, oh, I'm on the screen. Or could they somehow limit the utility of the network as a whole? So those were some of the questions that we came up with when we were looking at this, and oh, it comes back. Okay. So that triggered us to do further research this year along a set of questions, and I think in general it provokes questions from other stakeholders as well, and I'm going to tee over to Jari to talk a little bit about his perspective.
Thank you. Right, so my name is Jari Arko. I'm with Ericsson Research. And I wanted to talk about the techie perspective on this topic, consolidation and centralization of various internet services and applications. And that's a topic that I actually worry about quite a bit. So what can I do? What can you do? And I approach it also from the point of view, like where do I work? And you know, part of my history is doing a lot of internet standards at IETF, currently a member of the Internet Architecture Board, who's supposed to be tracking things like internet trends and how they affect the architecture. So here's a trend that we're sort of observing in the world, and what can we do about it? Well, obviously, we do need to understand it, we do need to talk about it, and we need to talk about it not just in our little corner with the techies or standardizers or vendor doing particular thing, but also among a bigger crowd like here, with people having different backgrounds from civil society and technology and economics and so forth. Just getting into the actual topic then. So I think I have, and I think most of you have also had this view of the internet as the ultimate decentralized system that is sort of equal opportunity for all. Everybody can play, everybody can reach the global marketplace, for instance, or global users, whether you're small or large. The interfaces are open for things that you want to build and so on. And that's true, but at the same time, I think recently we also witnessed a situation where on top of this interoperable, open, global, equal opportunity platform, people are building their own closed applications, for instance, or closed universes of things that are perhaps in some sense less open because they are owned by the particular application provider and they get to set the rules for that particular application. And many of us spend a big part of our day with some of these systems. So the question is, should we be worried about that or not? And some of the reasons for these things happening, first of all, this ability, the internet is has this permissionless innovation capability that you can build anything on top of it and you don't have to ask anybody's permission. That is essentially allowing anybody to build these things, the ecosystems on top of the open internet platform, and is free to choose which way they want to make the rules inside those new ecosystems. And some of them are relatively closed. Of course, in a maturing market, you have economics driving things, like economies of scale, for instance, and that's a natural progression on any industry. That's not anything harmful. And also network effects that we talked about earlier. There's also some technical things like speed of light or DDoS prevention that actually makes it easier for large entities to provide services, whereas smaller entity only exists in one place, very difficult to provide low latency for everybody on the planet, for instance. I did want to drill down just a little bit more on the terminology that Carl introduced. So consolidation we already talked about, and that in my mind is more of a sort of a control issue or ownership issue, that this entity owns a large share of users or controls a particular domain in some fashion. There's an equivalent technical term that talks about the technical distribution of things. So you could have a situation where you have a distributed architecture where everybody can discuss with everybody, or you can have a more centralized architecture where you have to go through a central point, or you have a database at the central location. And I think we're seeing examples of both in today's internet. Some examples of where this happens. Email is sort of an old example, of course, and it's again the ultimate distributed, everybody can play example. In recent times, what we've seen is that a fair number of people actually are no longer deploying email services by themselves, but are letting others handle that on their behalf, and that's just regular economics and makes good sense. Don't have to do everything by yourself. Somebody else can specialize on that. But we've also seen another phenomenon where it's getting difficult for me, for instance, to run my own services. I mean, I can set up the servers and do everything correctly, but sometimes I'm on the wrong side of the blacklist or the whitelist, and my troubles don't concern anybody because I'm tiny. And whereas, if some email administrator would block Gmail, their users would let him know very, very quickly that that's wrong. So it's difficult for me to play anymore in this space. DNS query service is another example, a recent discussion actually. And this is like, in the past, what we've had is like, all the different ISP networks around the world, maybe 10 million of them, had their local DNS servers, and if you were to query your name, you would get an answer from the local server. And now, due to the advent of these quad-N type solutions like Google's 8888 and others, and some new technology and some browser support for things, we're moving more towards a world where people are asking from a central location or central address or consolidated service for this, let's say the Google service as an example. And that's actually great for many reasons. You can bypass local blocking, good. You can deploy secure protocols faster, great. But it's also bad in some other ways. So now you had like these 10 million different things around the world. It was very difficult for any single government or entity to get to all of them. But you put it at 2 or 3 companies in the world, and suddenly you created a huge, very attractive data store for everybody's internet behavior can be tracked this way. And I don't think that's actually a good idea. So what can we do technically? Obviously, this is a topic that's very broad. It has, policy and legal and competition and society and, spurring new business angles, but it can also have technical angles, like could we do something? And I'll just give you 3 examples. The first one is interoperability. So I think we've observed lately that the sort of innovation is moving up in the stack, that we already have like, connectivity through the internet. And now most of the innovation happens in the different applications. But as I said earlier, sometimes these applications are pretty closed in their way. So they don't necessarily have interfaces internally for others to add something to it, for instance, or provide alternatives. And maybe that's a thing that we should be doing more, open up some interfaces. Another example is collaboration, federated systems. Carl was talking about this a little bit. Could we help the small entities work together as opposed to having to do something always through a large entity? And the third example is security related. Most of the internet technology and solutions that we build today is about communication security. So the model is that we protect against the evil outsider. Like the guy outside the tunnel, we want to prevent him or her from getting to the tunnel and seeing the traffic or modifying it. And that's great. We made huge progress in that space in the last 5 or 10 years. That's really good. But at the same time, what remains, and now we're sort of more aware of that also, that the other entity at the end of the tunnel, let's say your browser communicates with an application server somewhere. Do you trust the application server? Do you trust your social media network provider not to, sell your information or leak your information or convince you to, vote for somebody? You probably shouldn't be trusting them as much as you do. So I think the security picture is moving. Now we're sort of handled one issue. Now we have to focus our attention on something else. And we can do things. We can minimize data that we send. We can have better browsers. If the browsers are working on the user's behalf, they could do things like Firefox recently announced this ability to prevent the tracking that they have on by default, which is great. We can protect communications end to end. So there are some things at least that we can do. Obviously, I'm talking in the general sense here, and I have just a couple of examples, but hopefully during the session we can come up with more. So coming to the end, we have a bunch of open questions. I won't go through these here. I mean, basically just a question of how do we understand the situation and what can we do as internet organizations or individuals or societies or companies to help it, and what are the consequences? Do we understand them well enough? And then as a techie, what can we do as technology provider to address this situation or mitigate it in some fashion? So that's all I had for now. And Wout, I think you're going to continue.
Yes, thank you, Jari. Thank you, Carl, for this excellent introduction. except for the very intriguing picture we see, we also have 4 questions. What would you like to hear from this room, actually? What is the question you would like to address first, Jari?
Yeah, so from my perspective, of course, the technology question is the important one. And I already talked about it a little bit. I think the interesting bit for discussion here might be, like, what specifically could we do? Like, do you agree that there's hope in some of the technical things for us to do? Do you see a need in your lives or the applications that you use to do something different in a technical sense? Do you see something in the market space where additional standardized interfaces would help competition, for instance, or would provide more choice? I think that's the first discussion area.
Thank you. Who would like to respond first? Marco? Or you're just waving? And for the record, please state your name and affiliation.
Of course. Marco Hoogwoning, RIPE NCC. And just do we understand the situation well? I'm still grasping with it, trying to figure it out. But in terms of SDO and for full disclosure, yes, Jari and I know each other, and we've both been working on the ITF side in the standardization for quite a while. Is more or less also would like to add a question in that sense, and then maybe Jari you can jump in there. Is on one end we say, like, yeah, there needs to be competition in standard, but in the end the internet thrives on interoperability, so there is eventually a clear winner. And that's also, I think, a form of consolidation. The fact that in the end we all home in on that one protocol, that might be is a potential driver for consolidation, maybe. And to another example, and then that's actually where I would like to see your opinion on this. Large tech companies bringing proprietary protocols back to the open standardization, which is somewhat a controversial topic if you for instance, take Quick. Is that good for consolidation, or is it actually working against it? If a large tech player say, okay, here's my technology and I open it up to the rest of the world and for them to use. Because on one hand, yes, we're buying into their technology, but it is open to other people to make use of it. I would love to hear your and other people's views on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's actually two different types of sort of winning. Like, one is that does your technology win? That, yeah, this particular protocol gets standardized and stamped an approval. Fortunately, we're not really like running out of technical proposals and standards in the world. There's plenty for every purpose. So I don't think that's in some cases it can be an issue also, but mostly I don't think it's a huge issue. I think the bigger issue, which that's really the answer to your second question, is that I would like to be in a situation where different players can work with, let's say a large tech company that has come up with some technology and can implement their own thing and talk to interfaces in that tech company and interface to the tech company and interface between themselves with this new technology. That's a desirable state of affairs, not something to be afraid of. So I think it's actually great that people, like most results from IETF are actually some company made something or some guy made something and then later brought it to IETF, and IETF improved it like over several generations, and maybe 10 years later it's actually working well. So I think that's a good model for standardization. I would like to see more of that, and the question is more like, in cases where the large tech companies did not bring us a standard or open up an interface, that would be more troublesome. And there's also a distinction between, is the standard open and you can actually implement your side of it, versus can you actually connect? There's also examples. Ted Hardy was talking about the instant messaging history in a recent workshop, and he made the point that there was a lot of work on different kinds of standards for instant messaging, and the standards actually succeeded in the sense of they were implemented, are still implemented and widely used, but the actual ability of my instant messaging system to connect to yours is, very troubled today, basically non-existent. And that's for not technical reasons, but for policy reasons, because, I'm big enough, I want to grow my thing, and I don't want to have anything to do with yours. And what can we do about that? That might be a bigger question than a techie question.
Is that actually one of the main points, Jari, that big tech companies set up their own standards and don't bother about the rest anymore, so pass the IETF by, for example?
Well, they might do that, or they might still do the IETF thing, but not just simply allow connection where one would actually be needed for somebody else to do something. So I think that is a big issue. The details of how things get blocked is maybe not so relevant as that you can't have this interface. So I would, in some cases, like to find ways to, I don't know, I mean, I haven't really thought about this particular case very much, but, open up interfaces towards social media systems where I can program them better than, or I can offer new things there. But that's hard today.
Thank you. I'm Desiree Milosevic with Affiliates. So I very much enjoyed the presentation, and I'm trying to also sum up for me what could be done in this situation, because although I understand there are some benefits of consolidation, there are also huge threats to developers, to the technical community, to industry, and eventually users and regulators who are trying to find answers for this. So for me, I am kind of hearing that in some of the slides you mentioned that federation seemed to be, the federation of services seemed to be this decentralized way of addressing some of the issues. So if we maybe, if you agree, if we look at the social media platforms, they're trying to be more decentralized like Mastodon. We actually have a lot of difficulties maintaining these platforms, and they're not all secure, but there's a lack of technical expertise, and I think this is somewhere where governments and other organizations could help to actually do some digital literacy and support and incentivize these kind of platforms where the data doesn't get shared just by one technical player. So I think it's an onus on all of us for users to demand these services, decentralized services, but also have a knowledge if they can't get access to these higher stacks in applications where all the data and all the value is today. How do we address it as a society? So I think it's internet users' right to ask for and also obligation to try to use some of these and build some of these federated services, but also for developers to know when they develop something that the decentralized services may actually help internet users be more in charge of their data. I don't know if you agree, but that's how it sounded to me.
Thank you. Jari, Luisterplant, yeah?
Yeah, I think you raised good points, Desiree. I think there's actually multiple questions there. Like, when something doesn't, like, there are these alternative social media systems, but they are not particularly popular at the moment. So there's multiple potential explanations for that. Is this because the technology was not done well enough? Well, maybe we could help with that. We as a community, or the techies at least, could help with that. Or is it because the users are not demanding this enough? Or, is the lack of standards, is it lack of recognition in the society that we actually need these alternative ways? And so it would be useful, I think, to understand a little bit like where the issues actually are. It's more in the demand or ability to provide side of things. But social media in particular is a difficult space, because you just want to be in the social media that all your friends are in, and I don't know if lots of people have time for 17 other social medias on the side. So that's the demand side fundamental issue there.
Thank you. Final question.
Hi, Vittorio Bertola from Open Exchange. Well, if the question is what can the technical community do, I'm afraid I think that the key point is still not about the technical community, it is about regulation, because I think that in the end, especially in this kind of services like social media, when there is a mass scale effect, the only thing that can really be done that can disrupt these dominant positions is to force these companies to open up open interfaces to any other new entrant that wants to try to provide a competing service, a similar service, so that the new entrants can also try to access the user base of the existing dominant service, and otherwise they will never be able to succeed. I mean, we can use Mastodon, but again, no one else will be using it. All the people will still be on Facebook. So this is, I think, a priority for regulators. But in terms of what the technical community can do, I think that the technical community has to think about it. And well, I thank you because you are the one in the ISG that is taking this seriously and leading the work on this. But I mean, speaking as a policy person that has been, participating in this kind of environment for 20 years, but only participating in the ITF for the last 18 months, it was quite a shock for me to get into this environment in terms of the lack of diversity that it still has. So it looks like, everyone else in the internet governance space has been thinking about multi-stakeholderism, while the ITF is still not there. And it's fine as long as you talk about the technical standards, because of course competence is the key thing there. But now it seems like the ITF is moving more and more into making policy statements, at least in terms of some of the drafts that are being under consideration, and some of the effects of the protocols like DNS over HTTPS, which is one of the key arguments now, that really have some policy consequences that I think were not fully understood because the ITF lacks the representation of stakeholders that would have understood the impact on them. And of course, it's not by chance that the big internet platforms are, I think, overrepresented in the leadership and especially in the active people of the ITF. So the ITF is getting more diverse, but if you look at who is actually grabbing the mic and influencing the result of the discussions, it's mostly people from the big players. So the question is rather how can the ITF become more diverse and try to address that, maybe by interacting more with the rest of the internet governance environment rather than by changing internally the procedures.
Yeah, quick response. I think on the first question, it's probably a little bit of both, or at least like if the regulators do something, then also the technical community must act, and like you can't sort of do things in vacuum on either side. And on the diversity thing, you are absolutely right, of course, although I have to say that the ITF is maybe diverse in slightly different ways, that we have competitors and from different layers and different players, and that provides its own angle of things. So we often fiercely debate things exactly because of that issue. But you're right that there's not enough understanding of the broader issues and the input from the user community and so on. But it's very difficult to provide also. Thank you.
All would make the perfect step to the next topic, which is on competition. But first, I'm going to ask a few people, just hand you the microphone for 1 second. Jari asked, what can we as technical community do on this topic? So he would like to get a few messages. So perhaps you have none, just shake your head, but I'm going to go around.
I'm not technical community, so.
Your advice to the topic, what would you like them to do, or research?
Well, from my angle and from the Thomas de Haan European Commission, I think I would much more go into the, let's say, the competition area in which we have experience. I cannot so judge whether on technical level or other level we should do something, but at least we have working competition law for consolidation, both in market share as vertical. We had this with the telecoms industry in which you have had this consolidation. Okay, then I'll wait for that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any question to the technical community you'd like them to solve?
Oh, I thought sorry, Rolf Meijer. I work with SIDN, the .nl registry. I thought I was getting the same question. What do you think the technical community can do? And I regret to say that my answer would have been very little. Because I think I kind of feel that we're addressing symptoms and not the problem. To kind of summarize it, my opinion is that the major cause of this problem is C-level ethics, or lack thereof. And that's not limited to our sector. That's not a problem of consolidation, because I think consolidation as such is not a bad thing. If consolidation is to make our life better, that's fine. But if consolidation is to rule the world, to kill your competitors, to maximize your profit, to maximize your power, and to be the only player, then that is a problem. And there's no technical solution for that in any sector.
Okay. Is there anybody who has a suggestion for the technical community? Yes, of course.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Matteo Van Dyck. I work at the Dutch telecom regulator, ACM. So I think we'll move to competition in a minute. But as a regulator, as a lawyer by training, the two economic things that are happening here are indeed network effects and economies of scale. And economies of scale, I think, are well addressed in competition law in itself, and the up and the downsides. And network effects are in certain specific areas, like the telecom area, where they are less, on, for example, on the subject you just mentioned, the instant messaging things, and what the technological community could do more, from my perspective, as a regulator who is trying to reach out, but not always successful in that, is to make very clear in specific ways to regulators where indeed it's not technology that's a bottleneck, but policy, as was mentioned here, or economic positions, or other things that from a technological perspective are not included in your in the things you see. And I think most regulators are well equipped to understand then what problems you hand over to them. And then, of course, the question is, can it legally be addressed at this moment? If not, then you get into a policy trajectory where you need to find a momentum to create new laws. But under existing laws, a lot of things can be addressed, and certainly under existing concepts of regulation. And so the basic idea of what you can do to counter the negative effects of network effects is very simple. That's interoperability, and that's tried and tested. It's just maybe not applied everywhere where it could be desirable at this moment. That depends, of course, on your position. So my specific advice would be go and talk to people and really explain this is not a technical problem because we can't solve it, but it's an economic problem.
Thank you. There were at least some invitations to reach out and to have more interaction with each other, which is at first a good thing to notice. We're going to move to competition. It's already been mentioned a few times. And I have here Marie-Noémie Marquez of Orange, who will introduce the topic for us.
Hello, well, good afternoon. Well, it will be a short introduction about competition. As you may know, there are several reports were published this year about competition. We had first one from the UK. In the UK, the four-man report. Afterwards, we had also a report that has been published for the European Commission. And including in the United States, recently we had a report about competition for the digital markets. What I would like to say, well, it is from a business point of view. From a business point of view, a vision, I'm part of this digital infrastructure part, and you know the layer, this layer, and not the other ones that were presented this morning. And what you can see in this area in terms of competition, first of all, we can see that there is a creation and development of digital ecosystems, and these are due to economies of scale and scope, and also due to the acquisitions that digital companies are making. And so this way they are getting bigger and bigger. So they are extending market power and entering into adjacent or neighboring markets. and eventually extending to all the parts of the economy. And this way, they are creating what we can call, well, a report talks about digital conglomerates, creating digital conglomerates. This is the possibility. The problem that you can see here is that if they are making more and more killer acquisitions, there could be a problem for innovation. This is what we can see in this area. And so I think that we believe that maybe competition law should competition be evolved to take this into account and have better monitoring of these acquisitions. So this is one of the possibilities that can happen here in order to see if they are reinforcing their market power and abusing of their power. So here it is very important that we understand better the strategies of these players, because this is something that needs to be assessed so that we understand what are the reasons for this extension of market power. So the other concern that we may have is about the responsibilities of these players, especially when they have a dominant position, and also the level playing field. So in this area, as these market players, they act as regulators because they are setting the rules for the use of the systems. In fact, it is important to see that these players may eventually be tempted to abuse the position market. So if they have an anti-competitive behavior or use self-preferencing abusively, for example, we can think that we can have some rules to define on the market so that these players have to abide by rules. So the question is what are the means of the authorities to ensure that the platform's rules do not impede free and distorted and vigorous competition? And the last point of concern that I can mention is access to data. So in this area, of course, everyone has already said that this is the oil for the economy, and this is now an essential input for innovating and creating new services and new products. Then, has dissemination and use of data needs to be balanced with public policies, such as the protection of data protection and some other incentives for investing in the use of data and new services. For the business, what is important is that there is the possibility for the firms, for the companies, to have access and to use data for the innovation and for the creation of new services. And so this is considered as being important, and it is important to look for the best conditions to allow data sharing for the firms and for the production of new services. So that's what I wanted to tell you.
Thank you, Marie-Noémie. It's clear that the competition has come up a few times. It's also clear that some very good points were made that need to be debated upon, need to be discussed. We've formulated a few questions. We may not get to all of them, but let me start with the first one to the room and then see who would like to answer. But in view of the growing role of dominant platforms in the digital economy, is there a need? I'm going to put my glasses on because it's not feasible anymore. Is there a need to adapt competition rules and/or regulation to respond to the new challenges that our societies are facing? So, once again, in the view of the growing role of dominant platforms in the digital economy, is there a need to adapt competition rules and/or regulation to respond to the new challenges that our societies are facing? Who would like to kick off here? Yes, Michael.
Thank you. My name is Michael Ogia. I work for the, should I stand up? Oh, sorry. My name is Michael Ogia. I work with the Global Forum for Media Development. I just want to start the conversation by saying, I actually don't know if these are new developments. I mean, monopoly power, duopoly power is not a recent development. Of course, there are recent developments as it relates to the medium of the internet, but the fact that certain players have more market power or more, kind of power over the digital economy isn't new. And so I don't think that we need to reinvent the wheel or find new mechanisms. I think there are many existing mechanisms, existing market regulatory powers, or whether it's antitrust or whether it's new kinds of or existing forms of regulation. I just think that one of the biggest problems is that not enough market regulation is happening, period. And that has led to some of the massive problems of which we are now related to, whether it's misinformation or the lack of sustainability for journalism outlets, which often keep our information ecosystems rich. So I don't really know if we need to be having a discussion in that sense.
Okay, so paraphrasing it is because of it is the internet. Does that make it different than the train monopolies or whatever in the US, or the telecom monopolies that were split up in the 80s in the US? Is there a difference because it's the internet? Who would like to answer? Or do we agree that there's no difference?
Hi, my name is Joe McNally. I don't represent anybody except myself. I think that fundamentally there's a difference because if you look at any of the big monopolies online, they're a tangle of different markets. They leverage their strength as social media, as data brokers, as advertisers, and all of that is for a free whose price continues to change. The free that you pay Facebook for today is 3 times more valuable than the free that you paid Facebook 2 or 3 years ago. And getting to grips with that in competition and in market definition is truly very complicated. I wanted to come back on the issue of a level playing field and the strength of market players and the need for equal treatment. You'll be delighted to know that I'm a customer of yours. I use Orange Belgium. And in Orange Belgium, I get unlimited access to Facebook and Twitter, and everyone else has less equal treatment by you. So I cry a little bit inside every time I hear Orange talking about level playing field, because the rules of your playing field are benefiting the very companies that you claim that you need a level playing field against. And net neutrality and proper neutrality and equal access for everybody on all levels is an absolute first step. So arguing in favor of equality while in practice being opposed to it doesn't bring us very far forward in opening up competition.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's Marco Hoogwaning, Rijp NCC. I think what you said about, and it's kind of on the side sentence, was in the current environment. And I think we also must not forget that, at least my personal feeling is that what we sometimes call anti-competitive behavior is also sometimes driven by jealousy. We seem to sometimes pick on companies or pick on economies, basically not because they're anti-competitive, because we simply lack the competition. We simply lack somebody to challenge them. And we drive that, and we then say like, yeah, that platform is very much anti-competitive. It's a dominant market player, but we're currently lacking somebody in the market that can challenge that. For instance, in search engines, there is nobody there that can provide an equal service, whether we want it or not.
Thanks, Michiel van Dyck again from the Dutch Competition/Telecom Authority. I'd like to say two things. One about net neutrality, but first something about is there something new in the competition on the internet? And I think the basics are not new because the concepts of, like I just said, network effects and economies of scale are not new. But what is new is that this is a truly global market with truly fast rollout of new networks. And that significantly increases the network effects. So in that sense, I do think it is new. It has a new element, and as was also recognized by Mona Keizer earlier on the stage when she sent her policy letter to Dutch Parliament on the consideration of that maybe a new competition law-based tool which would be working ex ante, as we say in jargon, so and not ex post, that this would be worth consideration at least. So that would mean that it would be, according to her view, and that's supported by us as ACM, desirable to think about an instrument that could give regulators, being it European or national, the power to say to a big company that they need to open up their network or their services in a certain way before they committed a crime under competition law. So now the only way for example, the European Commission is to say after a company has done something that they did it wrong and that they didn't need to pay a fine, which usually takes years of working to get there. So the idea would be to be faster. So that is not fundamentally new, but I think it does require new policy, at least according to some. And then about net neutrality, I think that is part of the rules we have in place now in Europe, and that is mainly focusing on the access surface, where the technical rules are very clear, I think, in Europe, and the economic rules, which you addressed concerning zero rating, I think that remains a difficult subject where the politicians were not able to reach a very clear position on whether it's always good or never good, so it's somewhere in the middle. And as telecom regulators, we are trying to work on getting a clear line in all of Europe there. And the idea behind net neutrality is, in my personal view, that it should at least prevent companies from leveraging their market power by persuading telecom companies to give certain data for free and others not. But this can be thought of differently.
Would you like to respond?
Well, to my knowledge, in Europe there is competition in the telecommunication market. The rules applied in every country have created several operators competing on the market. Then, well, I believe that there is some competition in the telecommunication market in Europe, in every country. In addition to that, what I would like to say is also that competition law should apply at every layer of the economy. And then if, for example, in relation to a platform, whatever it is, for the small, for the companies that are working on the marketplace with these platforms, I think that, of course, the rule should also apply to them. So this is what I wanted to say concerning the competition, including at the platform level. This is for competition rules is for everybody at every level of the economy. So thank you for having participated to the discussion concerning competition. It's just a starting point, because as you know, it's only starting in the world. in Europe, in the United States, and probably in other areas in the world. This discussion has only started, and it will need a lot of time to understand what the market is, what these ecosystems are doing, what the consequences they have, the effect they will have on the market, and we need to make more research on that, on data, on the impact of data, and also on what these new ecosystems are going to do in the society. So we'll see. I suppose that we will be discussing this a lot of times, and then we will see how we progress on this. Thank you.
I've got one question for Jari, and then we move to the next topic. Jari, we in this discussion mainly focused on Google or Facebook, but there are very many different layers to the internet where Google perhaps doesn't have any role, or perhaps is getting a role. Is that something that you identify, that there's also concentration or centralization on the other parts of the internet that people do not see on a usual basis? Or Carl?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, so this is, as outlined in those 3 domains, this was something that we were trying to communicate to the reader, that yes, you have the sort of the visible internet for the user, where I think these trends are quite intuitive or perhaps apparent for the user. But then you have similar trends as well when you look at particularly that domain of service infrastructure. And if you look at cloud computing as a good example, you have essentially a handful of companies that really dominates that market. I think AWS, Amazon's Web Services, is estimated to have somewhere around 50% of the infrastructure as a service. And then you have sort of tightly followed by, I think it's Microsoft with around 25%. So you do have these trends of concentrations in other parts of the internet economy as well that goes beyond what we as users might see.
So there's an extra layer to this discussion that needs to be defined at a later point in time. We're going to move to the third pillar of this discussion, which is society. So you can think of access or human rights or other points of view. But David from Bits of Freedom will introduce us to this topic.
Yes, I think it goes without saying that our democracy needs an online communications landscape that is available and accessible to everybody, that everybody is empowered to use those communication platforms. Free from undue interference by governments and also by undue interference of corporations. Therefore, we think it's crucial that platforms and actors that service the digital information ecosystem should reflect the diversity of voices, people and communications that make up our society in Europe and across the world. However, if we look at the current situation and the trend we're talking about today, we see that a few giant corporations dominate within our current online communications landscape, and their dominance is increasing. It is safe to say that most of our online activity is facilitated by only a small number of players in this field. This is especially true if you look at, you can look at on the infrastructural level, say the telecom operators, but I want to talk about the platform providers, say a bit, we're operating more on the top level. This is especially true for, if you look at Europe, this is especially true for basically 3 companies. It's Alphabet, that includes Google and YouTube, for example, Facebook, that has Facebook itself, and WhatsApp, and Instagram, and Twitter. Just to give you an idea, in 2013, a study was conducted that showed that that a Google outage led up to a 40% drop in internet traffic. And that in 2017, 80% of the internet referrals, or like referring to other websites in Europe, came from either Facebook or Google. And if you look at the advertising market, you see that 60% of digital spending on digital ads is going to Facebook and Google, like the duopoly. So aside from the economic aspects, I just want to highlight a few of the societal consequences and pitfalls that come with basically scaling up. First of all, how do can these major platforms deal with the diversity of people? If you look at how these companies operate, they basically operate on a kind of, they have a monolithic system for different reasons, whether it's economies of scale, just to lower the costs. They offer a single service to a global population that has a very basically rigid standards, standard policies, and a monolithic architecture. It's very hard if you have a system like that basically there are forces to just offer a uniform service and apply uniform policies to address the diversity of all the users that use those platforms. This is especially true if you look at the way those platforms apply norms and values. If you look at the dominant players in Europe, we see that they are generally originate from the US, or they are based in the US, and that US standards become the de facto norms and standards that we have to obey to. Just to give an example that's often used, the way nudity is approached, content with some nudity in it is approached in the US is totally different, for example, than in the Netherlands. And if you look at content with regard to violence, it's also very different per country. So it's very hard for these platforms to take those norms into account. And the societal impact of those platforms is also amplified by the multitude of functions that those platforms serve, and the many different actors that use those platforms. If you look at the largest platforms, they have a very deepening impact on our society. I mean, basically yesterday, Facebook already launched that they also now want to, they launched their own cryptocurrency. You see that they also want to become a platform or a player in the financial services industry. But you see that they simultaneously act as an advertisement platform, as a platform for communities, activists, minorities to communicate with each other, and also to connect organizations with their customers or followers. And it also facilitates content creators or artists, or what we often now see is influencers who are highly dependent on those platforms. And there are also a lot of actors that are implied by these platforms. First of all, we use it as, say, consumers, as citizens, as parents, as employers, but it's also used by law enforcement, also used by intelligence agencies, by political campaigners, by businesses, and by artists. And all these different actors have come with their own specific problems. So the multitude of functions and actors that are implicated make clear that consolidation of our online communications landscape has potentially a huge impact on our society. The question is whether we will be able to solve all issues by addressing the individual symptoms. We often talk only about the individual symptoms. I think it's very important that we look instead, take a more holistic approach and look at the systemic factors and causes that are underlying the consolidation we're seeing right now. Think, for example, of the underlying dominant business models and the excesses therefrom. For example, the advertising business model behind many of those big platforms come with a lot of excesses. We should talk about those underlying factors as well, and not just focus on the symptoms. I think that's basically the introduction. You're going to introduce the questions that we formulated.
Well, I'd like to make it more general at this point, because we've obviously had several worries announced to us at this point in time. Is anybody actually worried about the concentration at this moment going on the internet? So who is worried? Raise your hand, please. I see 2, 3, 4, 5. So more people are worried now. So you've already had so who raised hands here? Who hasn't spoken yet? Marcus, were you one of them, or?
Marcus Kummer, I'm here speaking on my personal capacity. I'm definitely not an expert on competition law, but I'm also one of the guys who put up the hand saying I'm worried. I mean, just looking at the concentration of what Facebook owning WhatsApp and Instagram, that's just everything about everybody they have. And I liked the Dutch expert on competition law, the ex-ante approach. And I know the US, for instance, has laws on mergers and acquisition. And isn't that something one ought to look at when all the big players gobble up all the up-and-coming startups? And that consolidation is one word, but to me it sounds more like concentration, market concentration. Now, I'm aware there are different approaches from the US and in Europe, and there I would be interested in hearing more from the competition experts. And in the US, I think it's more emphasis on consumer harm, whereas in Europe, it's more a high-level approach to abuse of dominant position. And obviously, no? Well, I mean, as I said, I would be interested in hearing more about people who know more about that than I do, what the different approaches are, and whether there's any way of bringing these approaches together. But as I said, I have more questions than answers.
So there's already a role for the IGF right here to bring them all together. Well done, Marcus. I saw some hands up. Somebody here raise a hand that had not spoken before. Yes? There.
Hello, Antoine from Mission Publique. I will bring a different perspective. So for those that don't know, we are organizing a citizens debate on the future of Internet. The goal is to include ordinary citizens that are non-expert, non-interested in the topic into the discussion. In last September, we've been running in 12 countries of the world a series of preliminary discussion, and we had randomly selected citizens that sat for a full day face-to-face and discussed on the future of Internet. And of course, one of the questions was consolidation. They don't call it that way, but the question of big companies and big players having a role. And one interesting thing for the discussion, what in many countries happened, that citizens were not worried about that. And the reason why they were not worried, because they said, we've already seen that with Alta Vista, and we've already seen that with Yahoo, and we've already seen that with other players in Europe or in Asia that came where the biggest had 80% and then disappeared in the frame of 3 years, 4 years. So it's interesting that in their vision, this is not a real problem, because the history of what they've been seeing has shown that it can move very quickly in the digital sphere. That was a view from that side.
Thank you, Antoine. That's interesting because we already concluded that there's not enough input from citizens. Now we sort of have one from citizens. And is their point of view completely different from the people on the inside looking at the way things are moving forward? And that is another interesting question that probably needs some solving. David, you would like to respond, and then we move to the next topic.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly address that net neutrality has been flagged several times, and I think net neutrality is a great example of a, say, legal or a regulatory intervention that did not only include maybe reasoning from, say, the traditional like competition law perspective, but also incorporated perspectives from society, for example, to defend freedom of speech. It also incorporated perspectives of fostering innovation online. And I think it would be great to see, I think the net neutrality, particularly the net neutrality, I'm becoming chauvinistic, the net neutrality rules we had in the Netherlands before. I think those can be definitely a good example if you want to tackle some of the issues on, say, the higher layers of the communications infrastructure in Europe. So it's definitely worth looking into that and not look at net neutrality just from a, say, a competition law perspective, but a broader perspective. Because if you look at the underlying reasoning why we have those rules, it's much broader than that.
Thank you, David. We want to move to the next topic, which is on future research, because we are already running out of time fast. And I'm going to ask you to sit for 5 minutes longer, because then we can actually decide on the ways forward. I I have Zoe Batoung-Barthélemy from the University College in London, who will introduce the topic of future researches and what should be researched and studied in the future. Zoe.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being so patient with us. So, unfortunately, I also bring more questions than answers. But I think to summarize what we've talked about so far, I will present 3 questions to you. So the first one is, now we have defined a little bit what is internet consolidation. How can we measure this phenomenon going forward? What are some criteria or assessments for us to track and monitor when it is happening, whether or not if it's happening, and is it a driver for good or actually exacerbating threats or introducing new harms? Secondly, this phenomenon, as already talked about before, is actually changing power dynamics. So what are the implications for multi-stakeholder processes and governance models? And how would this impact future regulations or codes of conducts in the internet economy or in society or so many other aspects? And finally, what is the role for researchers, academics like myself, standard-setting bodies like IETF, civil society like ISOC, or any other player when we're looking at data, engaging with this phenomenon? If we're working with players like Amazon, Facebook, and Google, partnering with them for their data, is that an ethical approach? Because we're also reinforcing their dominant position. So how can different stakeholders advance without actually contributing or exacerbating the situation?
Okay, who would like to respond first? What direction should research take in your point of view? Or, yeah, Thomas?
Yes, Thomas de Haan, European Commission. I think if you say metrics, I think, first of all, I would be interested much more in the parameters or what you need to collect data about. But even before that, I think we would need some more qualitative assessment of what consolidation means. I mean, yes. We have talked about several, let's say, market dominance, of course. Okay, that's very clear. But even that is very scattered and it's cross-border, etc. So it needs some analysis. But also you have the, which also could be worrying, is much more the vertical integration. For example, Google is now also trying to have complete vertical integration with networks. Mm-hmm. What does it mean? So I would like, maybe there are much more qualitative analysis needed before you do metrics. Thanks.
Yes, I completely agree. We need to actually make sure that we're moving forward on the same conceptual frameworks across different backgrounds, even within Europe, in order to actually work collectively around this phenomenon.
Somebody else with suggestions, yes?
Thank you. I'm Michiko Hayashi. I'm just independent because my husband is participating in this, and I thought, well, it would be interesting for me too. The first question about, first of all, I'm just totally beginner of this topic, but looking at this consolidation, acquisition, recently, I found out that the good information sources like Yahoo Finance, if you look at the information services companies, who is buying what, and every day there is some acquisition or buyout of small startup companies, and before they even grow and start really innovating, they get bought up. And I think it's maybe like researchers, academics, they don't usually look at what is happening in financial or stock market. Mm-hmm. But I think the information, there is a very rich information on acquisitions, and maybe it would be interesting to analyze, so what are the implications, on innovations or on to the companies who are buying up these companies and ultimately for the users and consumers. Okay, thank you.
Please. Okay, hi. Melinda Clem. I'm with Affiliates, and I'm also co-chair of IGF USA. Shameless bit of promotion before I make a comment. At our NRI meeting in July, we're actually addressing this from two perspectives. The first is a very legal view, a panel that's looking at antitrust and how you measure tech companies under the current framework and if that's appropriate. And the second is a plenary that's more of a public opinion view. It's entitled, Is the Techlash Justified? You know, how much of this is public opinion and how much of it is an actual problem? I want to follow up on the comment just made. It was very close to what I was going to suggest. From a research perspective, the financial impacts and the business, the actual business consolidation would be extremely helpful information. And one of the reasons is that sort of a forensic accounting you really don't see. You see it when it's a big enough dollar to make a Bloomberg scroll because Facebook or Google has spent an exorbitant amount of money on someone. It's the smaller acquisitions we don't see as much, and that's how the footprint grows. But the other aspect of it is a little bit more difficult to quantify, but it's worth considering is it's inappropriate to have an absolute ban on these sort of things because some of these companies are explicitly going into existence with the intent of an exit strategy of acquisition by Facebook or Google. But it would be interesting to understand, if you could, what percentage of that happens and how much of it is more organic.
Just very quickly, if I may, before giving the microphone to Clément, I think to summarize both inputs, extremely valuable, and to tie it up with what David mentioned, I think we need to think about metrics and assessments from a diversity of disciplines. So include financial tracking, but also qualitative definitions. So we cannot keep looking at this problem with a room full of computer engineers. And that's the only way forward.
Yeah, very quick, and I kind of want to loop it back to the slide that's still there. Also consider standardization. I occasionally look into this topic, like market shares, etc. A lot of data is there, but it's not very compatible. A lot of regulators push out data on like market shares. A, it's usually a year old, and B, I have to read it from a PDF. And the same goes in corporate world. They all publish their annual report, but they all publish them slightly differently. It's almost impossible to automate this and work speedily. You end up reading hundreds of pages looking for the number you're looking for, and then it's sometimes not even that compatible. So my call also to the regulatory world is help us define what we're looking at, and because it makes it so much easier.
So, sorry, Wout, I'm just going to jump in with a shameless plug. So part of the work that we're doing this year in trying to understand better consolidation is that we have one line of work where we offer research funding to people that can come up with exactly what we've been discussing now. What is the relevant indicators to understand consolidation? And we offer funding for people to collect that data, and then we would make it available to the global community under Creative Commons licensing so others can do research on it. So if you have ideas, know people that have ideas, I just wanted to sort of shamelessly plug that into the conversation that we are offering funding for that effect.
Thank you. We're going to wind up the session. I'm going to give you 10 seconds. I'm going to ask one question to the room. Has the conversation we had changed your point of view on the topic? Because that's something I would like to know. If it is the case that it changed your point of view, please raise your hand. If not, then you're clearly all...
I don't want to keep on talking, but it hasn't changed my mind, but it has been very useful for me. So just to mark that those are not the same things.
That's a very good distinction. And I think from the sort of comments we heard, we have been looking at each other. And the way that and hearing each other, I mean to say it. And that's why I hand to Clément. What are the key messages that you've derived from this session? And just please come and stand up here so that everybody can see you.
So, reflecting the structure of the session, I have prepared 4 key messages addressing the 4 issues that we tackled today: technical, competition, societal, and research issues. But first, I just wanted to introduce the fact that there seems to be a consensus on the reality of patterns of consolidation in the various sectors of the digital economy. So when it comes to competition rules not only should be enforced, but actually adapted to the challenges of the new digital environment. Rules need to be updated in order to better monitor the market power of platforms and their acquisition strategies. So therefore, states should address the issue of the responsibility of these players and the issue of level playing fields. When it comes to technical aspects, consolidation results from market trends, but is also affected by the nature of the technology. So centralization of services creates new security threats and vulnerabilities that have been presented today. Therefore, at the level of the tech sector, industry actors should allow opening up their platforms, for instance, for social media. And what can be done is in terms of interoperability, more collaboration between small players, and also security efforts in terms of end-to-end encryption or data minimization, for instance. When it comes to societal factors, the fact that a handful of platforms facilitates our online activities has obviously societal consequences. Though they provide a myriad of opportunities, they also tend to mobilize US-based values and norms, and thus fail to adapt to the individual specific needs and due to their monolithic architectures. When it comes to the last point about future studies, the concentration of market power needs to be better understood. The root causes of internet consolidation, as well as ways to measure its scale, need further studies, and such research could feed into policies supporting models of cooperative platform economy. But as it was indicating in the beginning of the session, regulatory responses must not interfere with Internet's underlying properties, meaning not breaking the Internet. For governments and civil society, they should continue to raise awareness of the realities and the impacts of Internet consolidation. Thank you very much. And maybe just for the adoption of these EuroDIG messages, I would like, if you completely disagree with these messages, raise your hands to see if we could actually adopt them. Thank you.
So does anybody not agree what has been said or part of what has been said? This is the time to speak up, because otherwise it will probably soon be on the internet. And I can see a lot of happy faces here. We're closing up. First, I would like to thank you for your attendance and your active participation, because otherwise we would not have had a session, basically. Thank you for that. I would like to thank the org team that has been working the past months to make sure that this actually has the form it had, and thank you for that. Thank you for the scribes, thank you for the people putting it on the screen, thank you for the people in the remote participation, at least looking whether they had any. I'd like to thank SIDN for making the work possible that I've been doing in the past months, and EuroDIG for all the work in the background that also made the preparation for this session possible. And with that, I think this will not be the famous last words on consolidation, but that we will be discussing this topic in the future on other platforms. And I'll be looking forward to hear what is going to be said there. And for now, thank you for your attendance again, and have a very good EuroDIG.